Mark 16, 1-8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Solomon, bought spices so that they could go and anoint Jesus' dead body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they came to the tomb. They were saying to each other, "We are going to roll the stone away from the entrance for us." When they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, and it was a very large stone. Going into the tomb, they saw a young man in a white robe seated on the right side, and they were startled. But he said to them, "Don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who is crucified. He has been raised. He isn't here. Look, here's the place where they laid him. Go tell his disciples, especially Peter, that he is going ahead of you into Galilee. You will see him there, just as he told you." Overcome with terror and dread, they fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
Thank you to Andrew for reading the scripture today, which is found in Mark chapter 16, verses 1-8. The sermon title today is Just the Beginning. When is an ending not the end? I think of different TV shows that I've watched over the years where you watch the entire series of TV shows, and it used to be you had to do that once a week, but now you can binge watch them if you want. But I remember various TV shows over the years that all of a sudden had a very abrupt ending. It would be, there were endings that you didn't quite like or weren't satisfying. I don't know what the rest of you think, but when Lost ended, I thought, really? You're going to end it like that? But then there are other shows that have ended and, the show is going along and then you get kind of to the end of the season or whatever, what seems like it may be the end of the season, and everything gets tied up. Like this person and this person, you've been wondering if they get together, and this person goes off and does this great job that they wanted to do or whatever. But it seems like all in one episode, boom, 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 everything gets tied up and you're going, oh, that show got canceled. That's the end of that show. And I remember, some of them that you just go, really? You're going to wrap it up all in one show? They must have just gotten word. Okay, this is your last show. And they wrap it all up. And then there was the one time that I was watching a show, a TV series called Underground. And it was about the Underground Railroad. And there were all these different characters. It was a great, great show. Incredibly informative, very moving, and all of that. And you're watching the show, and the last episode that they had was, it left all these things untied. There's this person who's here and you want to know what's going to happen to them. And there's this person there and this person here and this relationship. And all of them they weren't neatly tied up. They weren't tied up at all. In fact, you were waiting, okay, that must have been the end of the season. When's the next season? And I went online to find out when the next season was, and I found out it had been canceled. And it had been canceled because it was a very expensive show, and whoever was producing it decided they didn't want to produce it anymore. And I was so disappointed, and they kept talking about in all the things I was reading that maybe somebody would pick it up again. But the thing that I started thinking about was that, okay, it probably wasn't planned to be like this. They probably thought that there was going to be another season, and there wasn't. And it left all of these stories undone. But this was about the Underground Railroad. This was about people who were enslaved. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, maybe that is the appropriate ending. Because in many ways, the story is not over. the story continues. When is an ending, not the end? As we read this version of the resurrection story, the one that we find here in the book of Mark, this one is maybe the one that is the most surprising. And it's the most surprising because there are a couple of things that stand out. First of all, where's Jesus? We hear about Jesus being raised from the dead, but we don't see Jesus like we do in other of the Gospels. But the other thing that really stands out to me in this passage, in this particular one, is that last verse, verse 8, where it says that the women, they said nothing to anyone because they were so afraid. And you're thinking, what? That's not how I remember the resurrection stories. The resurrection stories all end up with people being excited to see the risen Jesus, to hear about the fact that Jesus has risen from the dead. And that's how we celebrate it. That's how we celebrate it in church and all of that. We celebrate the fact that Jesus has risen, and it's exciting and it's great news. But that's not how it ends in Mark. Well, okay, there's a problem with Mark, because Mark, obviously, we're not the only ones who are bothered by this, because there are others that came on, and over the generations, over the years, these different manuscripts, later manuscripts, actually have endings, and it may show up in your version of the Bible, these different options for endings. There's the one that we read, where it just stops there. And that's what seems to be the most likely, the oldest versions of the manuscripts have that ending. But it seems that there may have been some people over the years, maybe some people who are copying the manuscripts that go, there's got to be more to it than that. And so they have a couple other endings. And they're the endings that you would expect, like, let's wrap this up. Let's tie all the loose ends, because we all know how it really ends. And I'm not saying that it doesn't end the way even the people who went along and added the ending. But this is probably how Mark ends the passage, ends the book of the Bible. So this is what we know by looking at the passage. First of all, what these women were experiencing was terrifying. It says that they were shaking with terror. They're different words. It's like if you go through and you look at how different versions translate this verse. And I looked at something like maybe 20 or 30, I don't know, different versions on how they translated this verse. And you don't get all the same words when it describes the women's reaction. But one of the things that seems to come up over and over and over again, they were trembling. They were trembling. And that they were awed, but they were terrified. What they had experienced was terrifying. They went into a tomb expecting a decaying body. And when they got there, the body was gone. Now, that in and of itself would be disturbing, distressing. But then there's this angelic being who says to them, don't be afraid. And it's like, yeah, right. Don't be afraid. Jesus is not here. He is risen. Go tell the disciples and Peter that he will meet up with them. This experience is terrifying. Now, let's get out of our 21st century. We've celebrated Easter every year and we keep hearing this story over and over again. Let's get out of that mind for just a minute and think about it. This would be terrifying. This would be scary. This would be confusing, to put it mildly. And that's what these women are experiencing. They were terrified to the point that they were trembling. And then it says they go running, they leave and they go back. And it says they didn't tell anybody because they were so afraid. Now think about that. They eventually told somebody because other people found out about it. Other people, why would the disciples come to the tomb except that the women told them? I mean, they did tell people, but maybe what it meant was, it wasn't this, whoa, Jesus is risen, and they can't keep their mouth shut as they're running back to where the disciples are. No, they run back to where the disciples are and they're going. At that point, it means they didn't tell anybody along the way. Surely they told the disciples when they got back to them, you're not going to believe what we just experienced. But Mark doesn't put that part in. He just leaves it here. But we know the result because people found out about the resurrection. And then the thing we have to know about these women was that they were not scaredy cat women. They were pretty tough. They were pretty brave. And most of all, they were faithful. These women, after Jesus had been put in a tomb, right before the beginning of the Sabbath on Friday. And then they had to wait until early Sunday morning in order to prepare his body with the spices and all of that. So they're expecting a decomposing body on Sunday morning. But the other thing that they're expecting is they're wondering, as they go to the tomb to do this wonderful, caring act for their Lord, they're wondering who's going to move the stone. They didn't say to John or Peter or the other disciples, or maybe they did, and maybe they wouldn't come. We don't know. Who's going to move the stone? And they're trying to figure that out on the way, because this is a big stone. But they are faithful. They are going to a decomposing body of their Lord. In their mind, that's their plan. In order. And when they see the stone rolled away, they walk into the tomb. These women are not scaredy cat women. They're pretty tough. And they're faithful. So those are the things that we know. But the other thing that we come to the conclusion about is that this isn't the end of the story. This is the end of the book of Mark, but it's not the end of the story. So why does Mark end here? Now, one of the preachers that I was listening to about how to preach this sermon, one of the things that they point out is, wouldn't it be interesting to end the reading that we just heard with, they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And then go to Mark 1:1, which says, this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is the beginning. Because the reality is the resurrection is not the end. Think about it too, in terms of Mark's community. Mark's community, the people to whom Mark is writing this, they're in Rome, a bunch of Roman Christians. Some are Jews, some are Gentiles. They may even be experiencing some discord among them, but they are definitely experiencing, or have been on and off, they experience persecution. They are at the whim of Caesar, and they live in the same town as Caesar. And so they're experiencing this uncertainty and oftentimes difficulties and persecution and sometimes even death. We've talked about this before. It's not been long since Peter has been killed by crucifixion, and Paul has been killed by beheading. It's possible the temple has by this time been destroyed. Mark's community is living in fear, or it's very easy for them to slip into fear. And can you imagine if they hear the words? They hear the words at the end, knowing they've all been taught about the resurrection, but the words that they hear is that they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Do you think those words would hit those Christians who were living in fear, living in a time of persecution? So what comes next? That's really the question. That's the question Mark is asking. He's asking the people to whom he's writing, and to us as well. What's next? What's next? See, resurrection is not the end. It's really only the beginning. And the reality about fear is that fear can be liberating or it can be oppressive, all in how you deal with your fear. Fear can move you and motivate you to be transformed. It can move us toward resurrection. If nothing is wrong, we don't need resurrection. All of this fear and transformation and all of these things lead toward the idea of resurrection, and resurrection is the beginning. We look at it in the book of Acts, which is really where we pick up. It's Luke's writing of the early church and what happens after the resurrection to the people of God, and how the gospel message and the kingdom of God begins to spread throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. And we see that, but it's not all hunky-dory. It's not all easy. But the resurrection is what motivates, is the power that is behind all of it. When you see the different sermons that are preached in the book of Acts, they all have to do with the resurrection of Jesus. See, the resurrection of Jesus is the beginning. It's the beginning. It's what empowered the church, and it's what empowers us. We see this in the book of Acts. Even as people are persecuted, they're martyred, they're imprisoned, all different things like that. But the resurrection is the beginning of all of it. It is the power. It's not easy, and sometimes it's downright terrifying. But the reality is that it is the beginning of the good news. We see this for Mark's community. Mark's community needs to be re-inspired about what it means to be resurrected people of the resurrection. Living life knowing that the resurrection of Jesus is real, and therefore our resurrection is real. They're empowered by that in a time and in a place where they're experiencing persecution and fear. And resurrection means something to us as well. We've experienced fear. We've experienced fear in this time of COVID. Maybe we're still experiencing fear. And at the same time, we accuse each other of, you're just acting out of fear. Well, we're all acting out of fear because we're all afraid. We've all been afraid this year. We've been afraid of so many different things, and we continue to be afraid. Hopefully, fear is not oppressing us. Hopefully, it is transforming us. Hopefully, we are finding in the resurrection a whole new dynamic. As we understand the resurrection after a year of COVID, after a year of being restricted to our homes, our travel is restricted. All of the things that we can't do because we don't want to spread this disease, this virus, this thing that has completely changed the way we live for a year. And yet in it, we have seen signs of hope. In it, we have seen the power of the resurrection. Because that's when you see resurrection, is when there's death, when there's fear, when we're terrified. That's when resurrection means something. And so let's look at this year that we've been through, and as we are continuing, hopefully to come out of it, may we look at it with the lens of resurrection. What is it going to look like in the future? I think it's going to look different. But hopefully what we have been through will strengthen us, will empower us, will help us to understand in a very real and meaningful way what is resurrection and what does it mean to be resurrection people. Resurrection is scary business because it causes us to move out into places that can be like what the women experienced, terrifying. But it's only the beginning. As we celebrate resurrection, the resurrection of Jesus today, let's not think of it as something that, okay, it's the end of Holy Week. We've given, Jesus was born at Christmas. We've gone through Epiphany and Lent and now Holy Week and now Jesus is risen. That's it. That's the story. No. We need to realize it is only the beginning. And resurrection is now and it's later. It's not just something we look forward to after we die, but resurrection is something that impacts our lives as we live it every single day. Let us live our lives looking through the lens of resurrection, in the power of resurrection. Jesus is risen, and now life begins.